Thank you so much for joining me in this video lecture. This is Gurpal Singh from Gursur Education. As you all know that we have already started the series regarding the subject of business environment and international business. Already its introductory lecture has been delivered to you, in which we have talked about the internal and external environment in detail. Now, whatever the topics were covered under the specific macro environment, which was the part of external environment of a business, we have to talk about these topics in detail. So first of all, the video of the first topic is going to be relating to economic environment. So in this video lecture, we have to study a lot of things, like we have to cover what do we mean by economic environment, and what are economic how many kinds of economies are there in the world, and after that what do we mean by different kind of economic policies. What is the capitalist system, what is socialistic system, what is mixed kind of economy, and if we talk about the economic policies, then what do we mean by fiscal policy, what are its content, how many types of fiscal policy are there, what is its relevance, what are different instruments under the fiscal policy by which government try to make our economy at equilibrium level, and after that the monetary policy as well. I shall be teaching you in detail what are the qualitative and quantitative methods under the monetary policy by which the government ensures the smoothened supply of money in the market. So in this way, I think you have already got the idea of what we are going to cover in this video lecture. Now I'm just going to share the screen so that everything is visible to you and you can enjoy this video lecture. Just to see this and enjoy. Hope you would be watching the screen, which is showing the topic regarding economic environment. We have already gone through from the basics of business environment, and if you remember, we categorized the business environment into two parts. The first was internal environment and the second one was external environment, and we further categorized the external environment into two parts. The first was a micro environment and the second was a macro environment, and I taught you that whatever we have to study in macro environment, we have to study these in detail in upcoming lecture. So this is why we are taking this lecture. In this lecture, I shall talk about what do we mean by economic environment and what type of economies are there. We shall be talking about private sector in detail. We shall be talking about public sector. We shall be talking about a capitalist system, then socialist system, mixed economy, and then we shall try to understand how the economic system works, how the economic system works. Economic system works on the basis of economic policies, which are categorized into fiscal policy and monetary policy. So a lot of things are there to learn in this video lecture. I'm just going to show you the screen, and one by one I shall be answering all the questions regarding these. So what is economic environment? So that refers to all the economic factors, okay, that affects commercial and consumer behavior. So what does it tell you? Economic environment refers to all economic factors which are affecting to your business. So economic factors are so many. Okay. You can take the prevailing economic system. Okay, you can talk about the economic policies. You can learn about these. Okay, economic structure, employment. I mean to say these kind of thing. Okay, all these things can be covered in the broad category of economic factors. So what is economic environment? The environment which consisted of all the economic factors is known as economic environment, and this can indirectly affect your business organization. So we see what is there for us to understand and what is there for us to read. So Structure of economic environment can be categorized into three parts. The first one is the domestic economic environment. The second is international economic environment, and the last one is economic globalization. So domestic economic environment talks about the economic environment within the country. It talks about how the economic policies are implemented in the company, what kind of a prevailing economic structure is there in the country. So it answers these broad two questions. Okay, when we talk about international economic environment, it talks about what is the level of economic structure of a world as a whole. What we talk about international monetary fund policies, WTO policies, we talk about so many things, international banks, okay, which is like World Bank as well. So we talk about all these things. And in the economic globalization, what we talk about, we usually talk about how the globalization is running in the world, how there is a free movement of goods and services, how all these things are going on. So this is known as globalization. Globalize simply means when you can move your goods and services outside the boundaries of your country, then that ultimately refers to globalization. Okay, so all these things are to be covered under the structure of economic environment. So I hope you would have got the idea what these three means and how these three environments are different with each other. The first one are domestic economic environment, the second are international economic environment, and the last one is economic globalization. Domestic just within the country, international just outside the country, and globalization simply means when you interact with the international economic environment. So this is domestic, this is international, just and their interaction within the both is refers to as a globalization. You can simply make that kind of structure as well. So I hope you'd have got idea. Now we shall be talking about what kind of economic systems are prevailing all over the world. So what types of economic systems are there? We are going to talk and we are going to study about these. The first one is capitalism. Capitalism, when all the means of productions are owned by the private entities only. Private entities. Wherever there is a privatization, wherever there is a privatization only, this is known as a capitalist or capitalism structure. So capitalism generally features the private ownership of the means of production and a market economy for coordination. So this is all about that. When word capitalism is there, you have to talk about private ownership of all means of production. So all these things you have to study under capitalism. So corporate capitalism refers to capitalist marketplace characterized by dominance of hierarchical and bureaucratic corporations. So all these things are there. All the means of productions are owned by the bureaucratics, or the dominance of a hierarchical system is all there. So you can see that wherever there is the private ownership of means of production or privatization is there, complete privatization of means of production is there, that kind of structure is known as a capitalist system or capitalism. The second one is a socialism system, when the means of productions are not owned by the private entities only, like they can be owned by the government institutions. This is known as socialist system. So socialism is a social or economic system characterized by social ownership of the means of production and cooperative management of the economy, as well as political theory and movement that aims at establishment of such system. So what does it tells you? What does it teaches you? It just tell you when the means of production are not owned or managed by the private system, this is known as social system. So when the means of productions are owned by society, when we talk about socialist system, we generally talk about this system of government. When you would have experienced that in some countries there is the complete privatization, but in country like us there is not a full privatization and not a full socialistic structure is there. So everyone in India is just running after the government exam so that they can get the government job. So all the institutions which are being owned by the uh, owned by the government, these are known as the public institutions. Okay, so socialism is the structure in which the means of productions are owned and managed by the economy, managed by the socialist, which is the government. And the last one is mixed economy. This is the mix up of both public and private ownership of the industry, and that kind of system is prevailing in India. Okay, so here are free markets with state interventions. There is economic planning. All these things are there. Okay, there is no precise definition of mixed economy. Theoretically, it may be referred to economic system that combines one of three characteristics. Okay, the first one is public and private ownership of the industry. The second one is market based allocation of with economic planning, or free market with state interventionism. So what you can understand in the very simple or layman's language. This is whenever there is the combination of both the private and public entities which are owning the which are jointly owning the modes or the factors of production. That system is known as mixed economic system. So I think you have got the idea. So three kinds of economic system we have studied. Okay, the first we have studied regarding capitalism. Capitalism in which all the means of productions are owned by private entities only. The second one is socialism in which all the modes of production are owned by the government or the public. Then the last one is mixed economy in which all the factors of productions are owned and managed jointly by private and public entities. So these are all the three kinds of economic systems prevailing in the world. Now we have to study what is covered under these. Okay, so these are known as sectors of the economy. So the first one is a public sector that completely refers to the sectors coming in the socialist system. So public sector is that portion of an economic system that is controlled by national, state, or local governments. So whatever the sector is owned by the government, that is known as public sector. You can simply include these kind of systems like infrastructure, police, and military. These are the public services for which the institutions are being managed and controlled by the governments. That government can be anything. So the first sector of the economy is public sector. The second one is private sector. This is the part of the economy which is run by the individuals or companies privately. For what reason? For just the reason of earning profit, and these are not controlled by any government. So they encompass all for-profit businesses and that are not owned by government. These are owned by the private entities. Private entities. You would be experienced that there are so many private companies working in India which are just for the sake of earning profits. Okay, so these jointly are known as private sector. And this is the most important concept. Sometimes this is asked in the examination. This is the disinvestment. Only single word can be written or this whole line can be written. All these refers to the same meaning. Disinvestment. Whenever the government sells some of its public enterprises or public we can say public entities, these are sold to the private ownership or the private hands. then this is known as disinvestment of a public sector undertaking. I just simply mean to say whenever government wishes to sell some of its ownership, like public entities or public companies, if it wishes to sell to the private hands, then this is known as the process of disinvestment. So the process by which government can sell its enterprises completely to the private sector or disinvestment a part of equity capital held by it to the private sector, this is known as the disinvestment, and it's all about that. Then there is joint sector. Okay, joint sector is the sector which refers to the structure of mixed economy. This is the structure in which the government and the private entities works together, like in the case of India. So wherever there are prevailing public sectors as well and the private sectors as well, so that kind of situation is known as joint sector system. So joint sector would include units in which both public and private investments have taken place. So all these things refers to the joint sector or the joint systems of the economic sectors. So I hope you would have got idea. If we are making the conclusion, we have learned a lot till now. The first we learned regarding economic environment. After I taught you how the structure of economic environment is made up, then we learned about types of economic system. The first was capitalism, then socialism, then we learned about mixed economic system. And after that, we learned about how the sectors are worked out in an economy. These are public sector, and after that private sector. Then we learned about disinvestment and then joint sector. Now I'm just going to talk about economic policies. These are just the part of economic environment. Economic environment. So as we have already studied regarding the public system or private system or the joint system, which can be categorized as a capitalist system, and after that there is a socialist system, and finally there is a mixed economy. Wherever there is a socialist system, there the government has to bring some kind of economic policies, not just restricted to that as well, but in case of all, that can be to some or the complete extent, the government has to bring about the economic policies. And why do government do that? Only for the reason that it has to control the economy of the country. When we talk about the control of the economy of the country, I usually talk about the inflation system, the inflation or unemployment, or you can say the period of recession, or you can say the period of depression. So the government has to tackle with all these situations. And how do government tackle? Government tackles on the basis of economic policies it brings in the economy. Okay, so this is why it is very necessary, if you are the student of business environment or international business, it's very necessary to talk about and to learn about economic policies. Why these are brought up, I have already answered that question. So now we are just going to move further. I'm going to tell you how many economic policies are there and what is their role in managing all these things which I have already discussed with you. So there are two kinds of policies only. Okay, so I'm just going to write here only. There are two kinds of policies. The first are known as fiscal policies and the second are known as monetary policies. Both of these have the different objectives. Okay, first we shall be talking about fiscal policies. So this is the policy in which the government uses its expenditure and revenue programs for producing desirable effects and avoid undesirable effect on the national income, production and employment. So hope you have got the idea of what fiscal policy is. So fiscal policy is when the government uses its income and its expenses just for the sake of managing national income, national production, and national employment. Just for the sake of managing all the things. What the government do? Government brings about the fiscal policy. And in the fiscal policy, what government actually do? It just manipulates its income or its expenses. Sometimes it tries to increase its income. Sometime it tries to decrease its income. Sometimes it tries to increase its expenditures, and sometimes it tries to decrease its expenditure. So these are the measures which the government adopts so that it can bring about the desirable situation of national income, production, and employment. So now I'm just going to talk about what kind of fiscal policies are there. Okay, so there are types of fiscal policies. So after that, we shall be talking about the instruments of fiscal policies as well. So first of all, as I have already given you the information regarding fiscal policy, so we are going to talk about their types. The first is expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, so when this is brought up, okay, when there is the serious breakdown, period of recession, or the high unemployment in the country, you can simply say when there is the period of depression in the country, then expansionary fiscal policy is brought up by the government. Okay, so what is that? In that, government increases its expenditure and lowers its taxes. Okay, so you can see here there is income and there is expenses. What we have talked in the definition of a fiscal policy, that the government manipulates its income and expenses. So in case of expansionary fiscal policy, the government reduces its income and it increases its expenses. When this happens, when there is the period of depression in the country, so when the government shall increase its expenditure, more money shall be there with the public. If the public has more money, then the unemployment can be tackled easily. Okay, so these are the systems which the government brings in case of expansionary fiscal policy. I hope you got the idea. The next one is a contractionary fiscal policy. When the everything is working well, but the inflation is rising. Inflation is rising just because the demand of the products is rising. And why the demand rises? Only because people have more money to expend. In that case, what does government do? Government brings about the contractionary fiscal policy, in which what happens? Again, government manipulates its income and manipulates its expenses. What does it do? It reduces its expenses and it increases its income by the means of taxes and by the means of expenditure in public development. So that happens in case of high inflation or high demand. And high demand is prevailing only for the reason that people have more money to expend. So if the government do these kind of measures, then they can easily tackle the situation of high demand and high inflation. So this is all about a contractionary fiscal policy. So now I hope you have got the idea. Okay, so as I have already given you information regarding fiscal policy, I have taught you that the government manipulates its income or its expenses just for the sake of managing the depression or the inflation situations. So there are some fiscal instruments as well. When I talk about income and expenses, so it's very obvious that there would be some of the areas from which the government earns. Okay, and obviously there would be some of the areas in which the government expends. Okay, so these areas are known as fiscal instruments. I hope you have got the idea. So as we have studied regarding fiscal policy, it tells you that the government manipulates its income and expenses. So to earn the income, it has some instruments, and to expend the expenses, it has some instrument, and these instruments are known as fiscal instruments. One by one, I am going to explain regarding these fiscal instruments. The first is budget. You know that every year on 28th of February or 1st of March, 1st of March, there is the issue of a budget. Usually it is in this period, okay, there is the issue of a budget in the parliament, okay. Budget is presented. So budget is the estimation of all the revenue and expenses over a specified future period of time. So this is the most important and useful instrument of fiscal policy which the government can use, because in the budget government can allocate the amount to different sectors of the economy. So budget is very useful instrument which is known as fiscal instrument. The second is taxation. Taxation system is the part of government revenue or the income source. So government can charge the taxes from the businesses, or it can reduce the taxes as well. So this is just to handle the income of the government. If this is increased, then the government earns high. If these are decreased, then the government earns lower. So this is the second instrument of fiscal policy. The third is public expenditure. So these are the sources of government expenses. Okay, where does the government expense? Government expenses usually in the area like education, health, infrastructure, and for the purpose of paying internal and external debts. So this is known as a public expenditure system. So all these things you have to understand. I have taught you regarding 3 important fiscal policy instruments. So I hope you would have got idea regarding all these things. The next one is the public works. Okay, public works. Public works are also the part of the government expenses. These are also the part of a government expenses. Okay, so public works are the works in which the government make expenditures on making roads, rail tracks, schools, parks, buildings, airports, post offices, hospitals, irrigation canals, etc. So all these in total makes up the investment or the expenditure in public works. So this is the fourth type of fiscal instrument. And the last one, I think this is going to be the public debt. Okay, so what is public debt? Sometimes the government has taken the debt from different parties, and that can be the national debt or sovereign debt or international debt. Okay, so the government has to pay their interest and the principal amount as well, and this is the also most important weapon to fight against the inflation and deflation. Whenever there is deflation, the government takes up the debt and it uses that money for public works. Whenever there is inflation, it charges high and use that money to pay over the interest taken for the public debt. So I think that was all the detail regarding fiscal policy and fiscal situations, and after that the fiscal instrument. So this was all about that. Now I am just going to talk about the monetary policy, and this is going to be the second element of economic system. As we have already talked about fiscal policy, now understanding regarding the monetary policy is not going to be this difficult for you, I must tell you. Okay, like we have already explained that the fiscal policy is the measure, okay, by which the government they just manipulates their income and expenses level. so that they can manage the complete equality or equilibrium situation in kind of national productivity, income and expenses. In the same way, there is a separate policy known as monetary policy. Okay. So what is this for? Just for the purpose of regulating the supply of money in the country, just in order to manage the inflation. The measure which is adopted is known as a monetary policy. Okay, now you have got the idea. Just in order to regulate the supply of money so that the inflation can be managed. Okay, sometime it is the need of the hour that the government has to increase the supply of the money so that people get more money and the demand can be raised. Sometime the government has to decrease the money in the market so that the inflation can be managed and the people have less money so that they can spend less and the inflation can be adjusted accordingly. So just for the sake of regulating the supply of money in the market, the measure which is adopted is known as a monetary policy measure. So what is this? This is the policy employing central bank's control of the supply of money as an instrument for achieving the objective of general economic policies. So hope you have got the idea. Just in order to get the best kind of economic policy and economic structure in the country, what the government can do, they can, with the help of a central bank, manage the supply of the money in the market. So when in economy supply of money is managed, the way by which it is managed is known as a monetary policy system. I hope you have got the idea. Now I'm going to tell you how this is managed. There are two ways to manage the monetary policy and credit control system in the economy. The first measure is known as quantitative measure and the second one is qualitative measure. So one by one we shall be explaining this all. Okay, the first are the quantitative measure. In these measure I shall tell you how the government or the central bank take the decision in quantitative form so that the supply of the money can be increased or decreased in the country. If these are increased or decreased, then easily all the systems can be managed. So the first quantitative measure is bank rate. Bank rate is the rate. Bank rate is the rate at which the central bank is ready to lend money to commercial banks. Okay, just giving you a very simple example. This is commercial bank and this is a central bank. Central bank. Okay, so central bank giving loans. So that is giving loans to commercial banks. Okay, in consideration of that, the commercial banks have to pay interest to central bank, and that interest which the central bank charge on lending the money to commercial bank, this is known as a bank interest or bank rate or a discount rate. Okay, and this is used for tackling the situation of inflation or deflation. Okay, how this is done? So first of all, what happens? The central bank can increase the bank rate or decrease the bank rate in order to manage the inflation. So just try to understand this. Okay, so if interest rate or the bank rate is increased, okay, then what happens? If this is increased, ultimately the commercial banks have to lend loans to the public, general public, and the general public has to pay interest to the commercial bank. So this is the case. Okay, so what happens when the bank rate is increased by the central bank? What happens? Ultimately central banks have to pay more interest to the central bank, and when they have to pay more interest, they increase the interest rate on loan given to the public. Ultimately, the public has to pay more interest to the central bank, so they have less money in their hands. So they have less money in their hand, and if they have less money in their hand, then obviously the demand for the products shall be decreased, and if this is decreased, obviously ultimately the inflation can be curbed out, or inflation can be adjusted. So during the course of inflation, monetary authority raises the bank rate to curb inflation. This line has the definition of this complete structure. In the same way, when deflation is there, then they can obviously, the central bank can reduce the interest rate. When they reduces the interest rate, obviously the commercial banks also reduces the interest rate, then the public shall have more money in their hands. In this way, the more money can be made in circulation of the economy. So this is the system of bank rate, how the money is adjusted or managed or regulated in the economy. The second measure is open market operation. This is when the government buy or sell securities, buy or sell their securities. Okay, this simply refers to buying or selling government security in an open market in order to curb the money or in order to provide the more money in the system. So when the government needs to curb the money in the market, they just offer government security. People purchases the security, government receives the money, and they just curb the monetary system. When the government has to when the government has to make more money in the market, they just purchases the securities from the market. So when they purchases the security, then they just pay the money, and then more money is in circulation, and this is how the money is regulated with the help of open market operations. So this is all about that. So that was the second thing under the monetary policy system. The third one are variable reserve ratios. See, there are two kind of variable reserve ratios. The first is CRR and the second one is SLR. CRR stands for cash reserve ratio. The SLR stands for statutory liquidity ratio. So what the government has to do, the commercial bank have to keep given percentage as CRR with the central bank. So they have to submit a certain portion or certain percentage of their money, of their cash reserves with the central bank. They have to keep these reserves. Okay. So in lieu of that cash ratios, it allows banks to contract or expand its credit facility. Okay. So what happens when the central bank wishes to control the money supply? What it will do, it shall increase the CRR. Okay, so the bank shall have less money with them, so they shall lend less money to the public, then there shall be curb to the inflation. In the same way, if the government wishes the public should have more money, then they just reduces the CRR. In this way, the variable reserve ratio is used for regulating the money supply in the market. So this is all about that. Okay, so sometime if the central bank wants to contract credit or reduce the credit, it raises the CRR. Then ultimately what happens? Commercial banks are left with less amount of deposit. In the same way, people shall get less money, and the inflation can be curbed easily. This is how CRR is used as a measure of monetary policy. In the same way, there is SLR. SLR simply is each and every bank has to keep certain portion of its deposit as cash with it. Okay, so they have to just keep cash with it, and this is a certain proportion of their deposits. So what they do, sometime this percentage is decided by the central bank. When in the same way, how the CRR is applied is the same way SLR is used for regulating the money supply. What does the central bank do? When it wishes to contract the credit, when it wishes to give lesser money to the public, it just raises the statutory liquidity ratio. When it raises this ratio, the banks are left with lesser money in their hand to lend. When they have lesser money, they shall lend less to the public. And when lesser money is lended to the public, then what happens? Then they have lesser demand, and ultimately the inflation can be carved out. This is how SLR can be used as a best measure for monetary supply. So I think you have got the idea regarding the monetary supply and what are the different quantitative measures, how the credit can be controlled in the market. In the same way, there are some qualitative control as well, which do not include any kind of figures, numeric figures about which the central bank has to take the decision. But the central bank can take some kind of a qualitative measures as well, which I'm going to explain right now. The first is changes in marginal requirement. So this is very obvious. I'm going to tell you one example. After that, you can easily understand that. So there are commercial banks and there are borrowers. Borrowers can be public. Suppose you need funds for opening new business or funds for investment or for any purpose. You just take loan from the bank, and in consideration of that you have to pay interest to the central bank. And while lending the money to the borrower, the central bank must have some margin requirements, which you can show, like they have to keep some of their accessories as pledged with the bank. Okay, only on the basis of these pledged items the loan can be lent out to the borrower. So this is known as a margin requirement. So what the central bank can do, they can tell the commercial bank to raise the marginal requirement. If the marginal requirement is raised, obviously the borrower shall not be able to take much loan. If they are not able to take much loan, they shall not have much money. Then ultimately the inflation can be managed out. Okay, so I'm just going to read this right now. Under this method, central bank affects a change in marginal requirement to control and release funds. When central bank feels the prices are rising, then the central bank controls credit by raising the marginal requirement. And how this is done? If margin is raised, borrower will have to pledge goods greater value to secure loan of a given amount. In this way, money supply, it reduces the money supply and inflation can be curtailed. In the same way, if there is depression, then the central bank reduces the margin requirement. Then it can raise the credit creating capacity of a commercial bank, and the public will be having more money in their hands, and they can lend more money to the for investment. This is how change in marginal requirement can affect and regulate the monetary supply in the economic system. So this was the first one. The second one is the regulation of consumer credit. The central bank can also tell to the commercial bank to regulate the consumer credits. Okay, so when consumer credit is followed, this is the situation in case of inflation and deflation as well, for just managing these two. During inflation, this method is followed to control excess spending of a consumer. This is consumer credit. So the banks which are providing the facility of hire purchase facilities and installment method, they just make some more regulations. The central bank or the banks or the persons who are giving these kind of systems, they just try to make some more stringent regulations on these kind of systems. Okay, if this is the case, then it will ultimately reduce the expenditure capacity of the consumer, and if this is the case, then inflation can be curbed out. And in the second way, if depression is there, then more credit facilities are allowed to consumer, like higher purchase and installment methods. Okay, if this is the case, then they can spend more and more, and the country can make out of the depression system. So this is known as a regulation of a consumer credit. So first one was change in marginal requirement, and the second is regulation of consumer credit. The third one is direct action. The central bank can take the direct action against the commercial bank who are not cooperating with the central bank for controlling the credit and monetary supply in the economy. So they can take any kind of a stringent action against any of the commercial bank. And what kind of action they take? This is there. It may refuse discounting facility to banks. Okay. So it may follow similar policies with the bank seeking accommodation in excess of its capital and reserves. They can just ask to have more reserve and more capital for the banks. So it may change the rates over and above the bank rate. They can change they can change the rate, and they can increase the bank rate. They can take any kind of strict restrictions on the defaulter institution. So these are known as some of the examples of a direct action which the central government can, a central bank can take. This is the Reserve Bank of India that can take just for the sake of regulating the credit and to punish those banks which are not cooperating with the rules and regulation and policies framed by central bank. And the last one, this is the rationing of credit. This is the central bank fixes the limit for credit facility to commercial banks. So the limit or the policy by which the central bank fixes of how much credit is to be given to different banks, that can be rationed on the basis of their capability or their previous performance. Some points are there that if this can be done in many ways. Okay, the rationing of credit to different commercial banks can be done by central bank in many ways. First of all, it can reduce loan to any bank. It can reduce the amount of loan given to banks. Okay, so first of all, it can refuse, then it can reduce, then it can fix quota for credit, then it can determine the limit of credit granted for particular industry or trade as well. So in this way, this can ration the credit which can be given to the commercial banks. So these are the four ways. Okay, the first we have learned change in marginal requirement, then regulation of consumer credit. The next one was direct action, then a rationing of credit. The next one is last one. This is moral persuasion or advice. Okay, so the commercial banks can morally pursue the other banking institution or commercial banks as well. So they can advise them to follow some kind of policies, rules and regulations by which the monetary policy can be, or the monetary regulation can be managed easily. So moral suasion is a general term describing a variety of informal methods used by central bank to persuade. Persuade means to make them able to use some kind of measures. Okay, just to request. They request commercial bank to behave in a particular manner. Moral suasion takes form of directive and publicity. So it's all about that. So when the central bank morally advise or pursue the other commercial banks to follow some specific rules and regulations so that money can be easily regulated in the market. So this is known as system of moral persuasion. I hope this was all about what we have learned. Okay, so in this video lecture we have learned a lot. I've taught you regarding fiscal policy, monetary policy as well, and different kind of economics systems, types of economies as well. I hope you have got idea regarding all these things. Regarding the next lecture, we shall be intimating you as soon as possible. Thank you so much for joining me. This was Gurpal Singh from Gurpal Education.